Okay, so on this video, we're going to discuss the value-added method of computing GDP. So in this lecture, we introduced the idea of GDP, and we talked about how we can compute GDP, or the size of an economy, by looking at the market value of all final goods and services. Now, this definition, even though it makes intuitive sense, it has some practical problems when we try to apply it. And so we're going to look at an alternative definition that gives us the same result, that is called the value-added method. And the value-added method essentially tries to help us when we have a large economy that is producing a lot of goods. And if you think about production, maybe it may take like 6 months to produce a car, and many companies will be using tons of intermediate goods. It may be difficult to keep track. Some of those goods, for example, a company produces flour. Some of that flour may be sold to consumers, and some of the flour may be sold to a bakery to make bread. So some of the sales are going to be intermediate. This other part of the sales will be considered final goods and services. So it creates a bit of a challenge when we try to keep track of all of this in a real large economy. And so the value-added method is an alternative way that helps us compute GDP and help us solve some of these practical difficulties. So let's start by defining what is value-added. Value-added essentially looks at, as the name indicates, what is the value that the firm is producing net of the value of all the inputs that it's buying. In other words, what is the market value of the product that it sells minus the cost of all the intermediate goods that it buys. And if you think about it, that's the value that the firm is adding to the product. If the firm is buying flour worth $10 and then produces bread worth $50, that firm, that bakery, added $40 worth of value. Grab a good, the flour that was worth to society $10, through the baker's labor and through the oven and the capital that the bakery has, it transformed that good into bread that is worth $50 to society. And so it added $40 of value. For this reason, we will obviously subtract any inputs that we are buying for other firms, like raw materials, electricity, business services, building that we rent, equipment that we lease. But we do not subtract the payments that we make to labor and capital. This is wages and profits. That's essentially what is creating the value added. And so that will not be subtracted when we compute value added. Value added is only net of the goods and services we buy, but not of labor and capital payments. And so what this means, for example, is that if we are renting a business, in some sense, a space for our business, that's a service that we are buying. But if we own the building, so that will be subtracted, the rent that we pay when we compute value added. But if we own the building as a company and we're not paying rent, that will be not subtracted in any way from our calculation. So there's some delicate distinctions there. Other than that, it's a pretty straightforward company, okay? And so in the case of our car, it was simply the value added will be the value of the car, which was $20,000, minus the value of the steel and the tires, which were combined $9,000. So in some sense, the value added of the car produces was $11,000. Okay. So let's do a little bit more of a complicated example. Let's suppose we have a pizza business and the pizza sells $2,000 worth of pizza a day. And let's say the inputs that or the costs for the business are, for the cheese, tomato, flour, etc., $400. Gas and electricity bills, $100. The wages for the baker are $700, and the pizzeria rents a building, it pays $500 per day, let's say. And the pizzeria uses its own oven that it bought for $6,000. What is the value added of this pizza place? Okay. And so here the question is essentially each one of these categories should be considered or not to be subtracted. So cheese and tomato and flour, these are all intermediate goods we buy from another company. We will subtract those. Gas and electricity, the same thing. Now the baker's wages, as I explained a moment ago, that's what's creating the value added, so we'll not count that. We will not subtract that. That's counted as income, labor income. And the building rental, as I said, if the pizzeria owned the building, it wouldn't be counted. But because we're renting it, it's an intermediate good. We're buying a rental service for $500 from another company. So we will subtract that. The pizza oven is a capital good. Because we own it, we will not subtract it. That pizza oven was counted towards GDP when it was produced, and we will not subtract the pizza oven. And so the total value added will be the 2,000 minus the 400 plus 100 plus 500. So the total value added of the pizzeria will be $1,000 per day. Here is another simple example that you can follow up and to illustrate the following. Let's look at this chain of production, supply chain. We have a farmer who produces $10 worth of corn. He sells the $10 of corn to a mill that turns it into flour, and it sells it for $15 to our tortilla makers. The tortilla maker sells that to a consumer who eats the tortillas. Now, let's start with our method that we talk about. What will be the total GDP of this economy? What will be the total value, the market value of the final good produced here? The only final good here is the tortillas that the consumers buy. All the others are intermediate goods, and so the total GDP here will be the $30 worth of tortillas. Now let's notice what happened when we look at value added. What is the value added of the farm? Well, the farm essentially, let's assume for simplicity, uses no inputs of production. It just produces $10 worth of corn, so it adds $10 of value. The flour, the mill, it buys $10 worth of corn, sells $15 worth of flour, so it's adding $5 worth of value. And finally, the tortilla maker is buying $15 worth of flour and is selling tortillas worth $30. It's adding the difference, $15 worth of value. So notice that if we add the value added across the farm, the mill, and the tortilla maker, what we get is also $30. And that leads to the general principle that if we add the value added by every company, what we end up with is the same thing, is the value of final goods and services. And the reason is pretty simple, is because when we add everything, we are subtracting the intermediate goods so they don't get double counted. So essentially, this goes to illustrate that adding the total value added in an economy is an alternative way of finding the total GDP, and it has a few advantages. So the main advantage is that it solves the problem of where should we assign production when production takes place over a longer period of time. Okay, so let's illustrate that with an example. Let's suppose that we have the following chain of production. We have wholesale distributor is gonna sell $500 worth of Valentine's Day cards to Amy's shop, and this transaction takes place in December of 2014, and then Amy is gonna wait until the week of Valentine's Day in February of 2015 is gonna sell $700 worth of cards. Now, as we see, Amy's shop really it's only creating $200 worth of value. That's Amy's shop value added, because it's buying cards that are worth $500, and by putting them close to consumers in a nice environment where people can buy them, it will create something that has more value. But if we use the final goods and service method, how we do assign production, we will essentially say Amy sold to consumers $700 worth of cards, so $700 will count towards 2015 GDP, because it was the final transaction took place in 2015. Now, the problem with that is that if we look at this example, we see that most of the value on those cards, $500, was actually created in 2014. And so that in a way will skew things towards when goods are sold and will assign all of the value at the end. If we want a more accurate description, we use the value added method. Then the value added method will say, no, the $500 will count towards 2014, and then the $200 that Amy added, that happened in 2015, so it will divide up, and $500 will count towards 2014 GDP, and $200 will count towards 2015 GDP. So we'll see, even if those two methods theoretically are the same, in practice, because we're cutting production, when production takes place over time and we have arbitrary points where we stop to measure things, a value added is a more natural way of dividing up production or the value of production over time. So that's one advantage. Okay, so let me finish the video here. Thank you for watching.